All right, today's lab talk with Silvia. Mi chiamo Daniele e sto bene. Wow, I still remember some Italian, even after 25 years. Puh. Grazie, Professore Luigi. Damn, now I want pizza. Well, not exactly breaking news here. Honestly, I could never date a dietitian. All right, focus, Danny. Time for Podcastle? Ooh, here we go. So let's get started.
The Community Lab, your podcast that connects professional communication research, practice, and people.
Hi, and welcome to the Community Lab. I'm Danny, your producer and host, and I'm glad you're joining me for the fourth lab talk. This time with Professor Silvia Ravazzani from IULM University in Milan, Italy. Let's start with a fun fact. Silvia and I co-authored a book chapter on whistleblowing in organizations together with Alessandra Mazzei back in 2021. However, we've never actually met in person. Not even at conferences. Maybe that's because as a PhD student, you're usually stuck at the kids' table, far away from the grown-ups. Besides our mutual fondness for Italian cuisine, Silvia and I share a deep passion for exploring the role of communication in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or short, DEI management. While I stumbled into the topic by accident in 2020, Silvia was already a recognized leader in the field. That's exactly why I had to bring her on the Community Lab, to dive into why DEI matters for a healthy society and to discuss the pivotal role of communication in all its forms in making DEI management strategies truly effective. So, grab a slice of pizza, maybe some gelato, and let Silvia's insights inspire you. Enjoy! Ciao Silvia, welcome to the Community Lab. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me, Daniel. Ciao.
Ciao. Silvia, before we talk about today's topic and your research in the field of DEI, I, as usual, asked ChatGPT to create an introduction. So, here we go.
Silvia Ravazzani is an Associate Professor of Management at IULM University in Milan, Italy. She is also a Senior Project Leader at the university's Center for Employee Relations and Communication, where she explores how organizations communicate effectively with their employees, particularly in times of change and crisis. Her research focuses on corporate communication, employee voice and silence, internal crisis communication, and communication in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has authored around 70 publications, many of which shed light on how organizations can foster more inclusive and engaging workplaces through strategic communication. She also serves on the editorial boards of the European Journal of Cross-Cultural Competence and Management and the Journal of International Crisis and Risk Communication Research. Based on her extensive research, ChatGPT thinks that she stands out as a pioneering scholar in organizational communication, particularly in DEI and employee relations. Her work goes beyond theory as she provides practical insights on how businesses can navigate workplace challenges, from managing diversity to handling internal dissent. If you're interested in how communication shapes workplace culture and inclusion, her research is definitely worth exploring.
Grazie, ChatGPT. So, Silvia, what do you think?
Very kind words. Thanks, ChatGPT. But sounds pretty correct. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So it's not outdated like in Tim's case?
Well, there are a few things, a few details that we could update, but overall it's fine.
Okay, so do you want to update or isn't it that important?
No, it's not that important. Maybe I can just say on a personal level that I'm a happy mother of 2 young girls.
There you go. ChatGPT didn't know that.
No, and in today's hectic world, I try to balance my academic career with my love for family life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very Italian, right? Family is very important.
It is.
Great. Okay, Silvia, this lab talk is dedicated to your terrific research on DEI management and communication. But before we focus on that, I would like to know why and how you ended up in communication research.
Okay, so looking back at my journey into communication, well, my bachelor's and master's degrees are in corporate communication, although I did not initially plan to become an academic in this field. And I chose communication science because I've always been, fascinated by the role and influence of communication in addressing real-world challenges, from interpersonal relationships to intercultural encounters. And when it comes to organizations, I've always perceived communication as a force that can bring about positive social change in business and society. So I decided to continue with my PhD in communication to study diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations from a communication perspective. And after my PhD, I worked as a consultant for a few years.
Okay.
As you know, an academic career has its ups and downs.
Oh, yeah.
And at that time, I felt that I needed something else, something more practical.
Yeah.
But this experience was really important to strengthen my understanding of how communication works in practice. And almost by chance, at some point, I applied for a position at IULM University in Denmark, where I had spent a semester as a visiting PhD student a few years earlier.
Okay.
And that was a turning point for me in returning to the academic world for good. And I spent the best years there and built, a solid career before getting the opportunity to return to Italy, to university, where I'm now happily settled.
Great. Okay. So, and how long did you work as a consultant?
For about 3 years.
Okay. And was it like consulting in communication or DEI?
It was in HR.
HR.
Internal communication in particular. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, it's always great when you have practical insights, right? So that you know what to study. So what are the problems in the field? So yeah, that's very important. Cool. What I also would like to know, what comes to your mind when you think of communication, generally speaking, but also from a research vantage point?
Well, I can give you my perspective.
Yeah, please.
What I'm interested in when I think of communication is exploring the diversity of voices inside and outside organizations. And often these are dissenting voices that challenge the status quo, but tend to be, in the minority in the arena. So I'm really interested in how organizations and their communication can be advanced, taking into account these different perspectives. Again, in order to bring about improvements that are relevant to people's daily lives and work. And I know that sounds a bit ideal, but that's the reason why in my research, I tend to focus on, socially relevant topics, employee well-being, diversity, minorities in the workplace, the constructive expression of voice and dissent, whistleblowing. We have a publication together. Yeah. True. But also employee activism, sustainability communication in controversial industries. So there's a lot that has to be, understood from diverse perspectives. But I think it's relevant really to take into account.
And what I would be interested, so when you think of your research and the application in your personal life, can you also apply something from what you have been researching in your personal life, private life?
Oh, yes. I'm very good at theory, but not at practicing. So especially, with colleagues and relationships at work, interpersonal communication with students. Of course, I try to apply what I learn and what I, do research on. I'm not saying it's easy, but definitely it gives you, some good tools to face life with a different attitude.
It's great when you integrate your own research in your professional and personal life. That's great. Now, I would like to turn to your research on communication in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's start with the basics, I would say. DEI management has been around for quite some while, but it's always been a very hotly debated topic, especially these days. So why is that, and how should we conceive of DEI management in the first place?
Well, I would start by saying that DEI management is a strategic process in organizations to optimize the potential of all employees based, on the recognition and appreciation of each individual's unique identity. And this leads to a fair and inclusive environment on the one hand, and the achievement of organizational goals on the other. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of research over the years highlighting, the benefits of DEI management, from employee satisfaction, understanding different markets, encouraging, unconventional thinking and innovation. But of course, it's difficult for organizations to put this into practice. They have to find their way. Every approach in every organization may differ in terms of goals or dimensions of a diversity in focus, could be religion, age, gender, but also the programs. And these priorities depend on factors such as organizational culture, leadership attitudes, but also the company environment, the industry, the national legal frameworks. And we know that today diversity is a buzzword for modern organizations that need to society's expectations of corporate responsible behavior. But we also know that DEI can be a controversial and polarizing topic. And that's because DEI management is associated with complex societal issues, deep-rooted prejudices, and more generally, the daunting task of harmonizing the needs and perspectives of very different individuals and groups. And this is a challenge that triggers debate. For example, several large companies are facing backlash for their DEI initiatives, which are perceived as woke capitalism, and not just in the US, because this kind of counter discourse is also spreading in Europe nowadays. And, some critics argue that the emphasis on diversity has shifted the focus away from merit and competence, and that companies are already adopting DEI rhetoric to appease consumers, while others insist that companies need to take action to tackle systemic inequality and, represent a broader spectrum of society. And in the end, companies are criticized from both sides.
Yeah, I agree. And especially, I don't know if it's as bad in Europe as in the US. For example, when you think of the withdrawal, so to speak, of DEI initiatives like at Meta, at Google. So what do you think about that? I think it's bad. And recently, Donald Trump said, we spent $8 million on making mice transgender, which is totally wrong, of course. But, it fuels this debate that, it's so bad. And do you think there will be some negative consequences when they withdraw from those initiatives? Because many people, especially in the US, white supremacists, very conservative people, they're celebrating it. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think Europe is quite different, but there may be consequences here too, because consider that many multinational organizations based in Europe are American organizations. And now there are even words that cannot be used. And I know many practitioners, DEI managers now are wondering, how should we call the things we do every day? So there's an open debate even here, even though we have a sort of different perspective on DEI. So we have to keep our eyes open, I think, and keep, the debate open, not to incur in that kind of discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me a little bit on interviews I conducted during my PhD with DEI managers in Austria and in Germany. And they said, sometimes we just, avoid putting this DEI label on initiatives. So because then there is no backlash or no criticism. So we avoid that. It's a very tricky and difficult topic. But okay. Yeah. What I'm also interested in is because you published on this topic and there's some research on that. So you also explored a very interesting intersection, the relationship between DI management and corporate social responsibility, or in short, CSR. Where do these two fields overlap and how do they influence each other?
Okay, we can start with this premise. Both CSR and DI management stem from the growing recognition that companies today must meet the pressing demands of internal and external stakeholders, not only to ensure competitive success, but also their legitimacy. Mm-hmm. So most CSR research has focused on external stakeholders, but internal CSR practices and their close link to DI management are important, but largely ignored. And internal CSR includes practices related to employee well-being, such as employee health and safety, work-life balance, employee training, equal opportunities. So DEI represents one of the main areas of concern of internal CSR. Mm-hmm. And in my own research, I strive to establish this link between CSR and DEI, focusing in particular on the external communication that organizations use to give, visibility and legitimacy to these two areas. Mm-hmm. And organizations, in fact, communicate about internal CSR practices, including DI, for two reasons. Yeah. To reassure external stakeholders of their commitment and good corporate citizenship, mm-hmm. But also to foster employee identification through perceived internal respect and external prestige. And in one study, I investigated the multimodal discursive strategies used by organizations like Microsoft to bridge DI and CSR in their online external communication. And we found that DI is integrated strategically as a part of both, internal CSR and the broader CSR practices. Mm-hmm. So companies, for example, use the multimodal representation of people from diverse backgrounds in images and videos. They use employees as storytellers, or they give visibility to collaboration with external stakeholders like diverse suppliers or underrepresented communities. Mm-hmm. But we also identified a major weakness in the way organizations communicate internal CSR and DI in particular. Mm-hmm. They tend to use a general diversity discourse that rarely describes specific programs and, concrete outcomes. So they report on the same dimensions, usually gender, culture, the same buzzwords, the same abstract images. Yeah. And in the end, companies are so similar in their rhetoric mm-hmm. that their strategies are indistinguishable from one another. Mm-hmm. So this creates a discourse of sameness mm-hmm. that undermines the credibility of organizational efforts. So that's a little bit dangerous.
Mm-hmm. I don't know it, but maybe there's a template or a checklist. So it's like, okay, we have to mention this, that. Mm-hmm. Okay, check. Okay, we're good. That's tricky, but very, very interesting research. Yeah, let's go to the communication part. DI initiatives often trigger backlash. Of course, we already mentioned that, and which ultimately makes strategic communication all the more important. From what you've seen in your research, I'm curious, to what extent do companies align their DEI communication strategy with the broader DEI management approach?
A well-conceived internal and external communication strategy is essential to raise awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues and to showcase the organization's DI objectives, initiatives, the achievements. Mm-hmm. And even if a DI strategy is well-intentioned and planned, poorly executed communication can create backlash.
Yeah.
And according to research, there are 2 general principles that we all preach in corporate marketing communication, but which are extremely important in the context of DI.
Mm-hmm.
So first, to be authentic by ensuring coherence between discourse and action.
Mm-hmm.
So to ensure credibility in communication, organizations should focus on reporting tangible DI initiatives and results rather than relying on broad symbolic statements and generic images that serve as diversity washing.
Yeah.
And internally, this can be achieved through the visible commitment and role modeling of both senior and middle management.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also important to have, a clear and consistent DI strategy upheld over time, avoiding abrupt changes simply to align with external pressures or to imitate competitors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Second principle, be consistent by ensuring coherence between internal and external communication.
Yeah.
So continuous alignment can prevent criticism and the perception of inauthenticity. So avoiding contradictions that might harm the organization's credibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Since external communication targets both internal and external stakeholders, can also foster what we call the auto-communication effect on DI, enhancing employee identification while boosting the overall effectiveness of well-coordinated communication efforts.
Yeah.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I know this, but continuous alignment between DI strategy and DI communication strategy is key.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also what we know from, exploring organizations and DI practices in organizations.
Very interesting and very important as well. So, because I can remember when I conducted those interviews with DI managers in Germany and Austria, and also talked to, not in all companies, but some of them also with the communication managers. And it was so interesting that most of the time there is no alignment between their diversity goals, what they want to achieve, and the communication. And sometimes they really underestimate the power of communication and how important it is. It was like, yeah, we do that. And sometimes we have a press release or a social media posting. And sometimes we, in our intranet, we put an article, whatever. And everything is fine. And then they are surprised that there's backlash. So, interesting. But so you already mentioned external, internal communication. Actually, they should be aligned or integrated. Integrated communication, also a huge topic. But even though they're intertwined, I want to talk about both separately a little bit. You've analyzed strategies from big corporations like Google, but you also said Microsoft, but also other companies. So I'm curious what stood out to you and what are some of the biggest challenges organizations face when they communicate DEI externally, besides, that it should be aligned with the goals or with the DEI strategy itself?
Well, external communication helps to promote DEI policies through public statements, workplace stories, reports, and organizations do that to build external credibility for employer branding and a good reputation for diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And research has found that corporate websites and online platforms today dominate external communication efforts, including sustainability reports, employee recruitment sites. And in my own research, I examined how companies such as Google portray DI in their multimodal corporate communication in external digital environments, corporate websites, blogs, videos. And we have found that not only verbal language is important, but the visual language also contributes to making the framing of DI management effective or ineffective and to the perception of the authenticity of the organization's actions. And all these must be rooted in the specificities of the organizational context, not to fall into visual cliché and isomorphic communication practices that lead stakeholders to perceive this external communication of DI as a symbolic tool.
Yeah.
So language and framing are crucial to the external communication of DI. Also, if you think of the different national and cultural contexts, because these causes and sensitivities regarding DI can differ depending on the country.
Yeah.
So while an organization should remain true to its core DI values,
If they have some.
they must navigate the challenge of conveying these values in regions where they could be misinterpreted or even provoke backlash from stakeholders. And that's also another challenge, the link that we mentioned before between communication and concrete measures to avoid skepticism. So this can happen when companies claim in their public statements that they value a diverse workforce, but they do not actually put this into practice.
Yeah.
And in my studies on DI in Italy, I have found that organizations seem to be aware of the danger of diversity washing and that it is important to prove their DI efforts before communicating externally.
Yeah, makes sense.
But the decision of Italian organizations to avoid or downplay external communication could also prove detrimental in the long run because it's important to send a visible signal of commitment.
Yeah.
If the communication is absent, this can raise doubts about the company's concrete commitment. So the external communication of DI is confronted with several critical decisions.
Okay.
Which diversity discourses to emphasize or downplay, how all this should be framed multimodally with the choice of words and images, how to do so in different national contexts, how to balance external communication with internal communication and practices.
Yeah, a very, very complex issue, right? Especially because it's such a sensitive or also provocative topic, right? Okay, then let's switch to internal DEI communication. I already talked with Sabine in the first lab talk about that. Employees, they are also communicators and ambassadors of an organization and its values, right? Based on your research, what strategies do companies use to engage employees in their DEI efforts? And where do they occasionally go wrong?
Well, we know that internal communication is a catalyst for increasing employee engagement in DI activities and, the perception of an inclusive climate. And we already pointed out that engaged employees can act as credible ambassadors and storytellers in the external communication of DI. And research gives us some clues as to how DI can be communicated most effectively internally. So storytelling and interpersonal communication, for example, through internal events, are key to fostering employee engagement. Mediated communication is also important to inform about the company's goals, the initiatives, the personal benefits of DI measures, giving substance and credibility to the DI strategy. Then a bottom-up dialogue and a listening ear, including the involvement of employee resource groups, dealing with specific DI issues. And finally, diversity-oriented leadership, inspiring DI-sensitive attitudes and behaviors, to build a real culture of inclusion. But the internal communication of DI is no easy task, and DI strategies and internal communications face the challenge of countering the phenomena of workplace backlash and dissent that you mentioned. And internal criticism is more likely when programs focus only on certain diversity dimensions, for example, women. When employees perceive sporadic DI initiatives, or when employees instead experience reverse discrimination when they are excluded from certain opportunities. And in my longitudinal studies on DI in Italy, I found some barriers that have persisted over time, which also hinder effective communication of DI internally.
Okay.
So first, a low awareness of the benefits arising from the DI strategy, which also indicates that internal communication is still ineffective or insufficient. And second, cultural resistance to some DI issues and initiatives. And from some case studies and qualitative interviews in Italian organizations, we know that cultural resistance prevails among senior and middle managers. And often they do not provide the employees with the resources and the time to participate in DI programs. And in general, critics are divided among those who believe there are no problems with discrimination in the organization or that more pressing issues require the organization's attention, and those that instead criticize the organization's efforts as insufficient, inauthentic, or insensitive to certain DI issues. So similar to the external communication of DI, internal communication also faces a number of challenges, but is indispensable as a visible sign of commitment and responsibility and as a tool for informing and engaging organizational stakeholders at all levels.
Okay. What I'm also interested in is, for example, the use of inclusive language. You neutralize the gender, for example. So there's several ways how you can do that in German. And that also triggers a lot of backlash. Like you mentioned, don't we have other problems here? You know, it ruins the language with a gender star or a colon and stuff like that. So how does it look like in Italy?
There's a discussion around inclusive language, and I know it's the focus of many training programs nowadays. Organizations are even releasing manuals and manifestos of inclusive language. So I think the goal behind these initiatives is to raise awareness of how to build, healthy relationships at work without insisting too much on the details you were mentioning, but more, on how to approach people and relationships in a way that is, sensitive to all needs and all backgrounds. I think this is important.
And do you also have sometimes stars or something like that in Italian?
I know that some organizations and even universities now have adopted this kind of inclusive language or inclusive way to address people in emails or, formal documents. I think we should read these as a sign of, again, being more aware of diversity around us. Now, if it's right or wrong, I cannot tell you, but it's definitely a good sign that we are debating about these things in society, that we're not closing the door.
I agree. And what is also important to mention is that inclusive language, of course, is not only about gender. I just wanted to mention that. Okay, then let's talk takeaways of your research. What should communication professionals and DI managers keep in mind when it comes to crafting effective internal and external DI communication? And are there any key pitfalls they should watch out for?
Internally, I would advise communication professionals and DI managers to use internal communication, but with caution. Also, in your studies on DI, Daniel, you have highlighted that internal communicators should not label all communication initiatives with DI because an overemphasis can lead to reluctance from all employees, even those who are in favor of DI programs. And there's also a delicate balance to be achieved between valuing diversity in the workplace and the need for unity within the organization, so as not to risk losing the organizational shared purpose and identity. And there's no universal recipe. Everything has to be constructed on the basis of the specific culture and context. And externally, I would say that attention should be paid to the authenticity of the DI discourse For example, it's important to show that there's a solid foundation for the DI strategy in the workplace by communicating the company-specific DI definition, the concrete programs, the allocated resources, the employee stories, in a way that is consistent with the actual organizational context and population.
Makes sense.
And in my research, again, among Italian DI strategists, I have found that many organizations also cite partnerships and certifications with qualified external bodies as a form of credible evidence of their programs and results. And this works very well.
Really? Okay. I thought like it's a bit of a facade, but interesting that it's working.
It's a way to prove we're really doing something internally. So it's not, diversity washing. They provide evidence and facts.
Okay, great. Because I mentioned the pitfalls. So in your research, did you observe examples of really bad ones? You shouldn't do it this way. Did you observe something like that?
Let me think this one here. I have to be polite because
No
I can't
problem.
relieve, sensitive data.
Okay.
I have many examples, but I'm not sure I can cite them.
Yeah. No. So of course.
I have many examples, but I cannot disclose them. Sorry.
Good. So I'm a bit sad now, but it's fine. Okay, then one last point that might be very interesting for communication professionals, DI managers, but also, and here is the point, leaders. As we both know, leadership plays a crucial role in an organization's DEI efforts. So whether it's top managers or even the CEO, their involvement and support can make all the difference. So what advice would you give organizations on how to approach leadership communication, both internally and externally, when it comes to DEI?
Well, when it comes to DI management and communication, the visible commitment and role model function of both top and middle management is crucial, as they can act as game changers for DI. And in the literature, we speak of diversity-oriented leadership, so leadership behavior that welcomes and values the contributions of employees from diverse backgrounds. So it's very important to build a culture and to train leaders to be inclusive, empathetic, so they can have a decisive influence on the perception of an inclusive workplace through supportive actions. So again, behavior, actions, and concrete measures are what counts the most in DI, because people want to see that they walk the talk. And I can tell you, in a recent study we are running now of more than 300 Italian employees, we found that diversity-oriented leadership has a greater impact on creating an inclusive climate and employee engagement than internal communication of DI.
Okay, interesting.
Yes, and also leads to organizational citizenship behaviors. So supportive employee behaviors that go beyond the job description and manifest themselves in these areas of loyalty, obedience, participation. So leadership is the key variable in DI management and communication.
What I'm also interested in is, for example, the phenomenon of CEO advocacy or CEO activism. I don't know if you studied, to be honest, but what's your opinion on that, and what have you observed so far as a researcher, but also as a private person?
Well, CEO activism is increasing, and we see corporate leaders taking public stances on political, social, environmental issues, DI included. There's a risk because they extend, beyond the scope of their company's business interests, and sometimes they even communicate or take stances that are far away from the company's stance on the same issue. So again, alignment in an ideal word should be the rule. So making sure that my DI strategy is aligned with all my DI communication, including the CEO activism in this area. But again, it's very difficult to control because this is related to people and what people think and say on social media or in other kind of public statements. So it's a risky business for CEOs to enter this kind of arena.
It just popped up in my mind, and I'm also not allowed to disclose it. There was a company, they were like, yeah, DEI is very important. We do these and those initiatives. And then the CEO showed up and he said, like, it's total crap. So we have other priorities, but, we have to do it, but I don't believe in it. And so business is business.
There are supporters that are saying, well, this CEO activism, these statements demonstrate responsibility leadership, for example, in the DI area. But critics argue that the CEOs should focus on their companies and avoid, becoming entangled in these political or social debates.
Yeah, it's a very controversially debated topic. So if I was a CEO, I would be an activist, but this is a different topic. Thank you, Silvia, for those insights, also for practitioners. Before we come to our much beloved quickfire round, I would like to know what's next on your agenda, because as we know, research never stops.
Exactly. So I'm currently working on 2 research topics that are actually connected to DI. And first, employee activism. We mentioned CEO activism, but I'm more interested in employees.
Okay.
And we know from the news that more and more employees are speaking out publicly on relevant social issues and engaging in collective action to bring about social change by advocating for or against company policies or decision making. And the social issues that employees advocate for can be very diverse. Issues related to DI, immigration, climate change, income inequality. So they act as internal advocates or disruptors, which are, generally seen as obstacles or risks in the literature and within organizations.
Okay.
And through research in Italy and the US, we are trying to broaden the view of employee activism as an opportunity for proactive change within organizations. For example, regulating voice through training, policing, listening processes can give organizations an advantage in anticipating and mitigating the risks related to employee activism. And the second area I'm doing research about recently is emotional intelligence.
Okay, interesting.
So similar to activism, emotions in the workplace have traditionally been seen as a barrier to inform decision-making and action.
Okay.
And we are exploring the role of internal communication in maintaining the ability to manage one's own emotions and those of others to enable effective relationship management. And we are currently collecting data through interviews with internal communication managers. And one of the key preliminary findings relates to emotionally intelligent leaders and how they can improve employee-related outcomes, such as engagement, both directly in, interpersonal employee-manager communication and indirectly by fostering a supportive organizational culture and climate. So I hope I'll be able to tell you more about employee activism and emotional intelligence in the workplace in the near future.
Great. I think I'm very intelligent, but I'm not sure about emotional intelligence. So can you just quickly define for us what you mean by emotional intelligence and why it is important for leaders?
Well, let's start from saying it's an ability that has been overlooked for some time, especially when we look at the workplace. It's also called the emotional quotient, and it's the individual ability to recognize, understand emotions in yourself and in others. But it's a crucial skill today because people having this sort of capacity can navigate social relationships, they can build stronger relationships, they can make better decisions. If you can manage emotions in a constructive way, it can be a lever that you can use, in your work and your personal settings.
Okay, great. I'm really looking forward to the findings. It sounds very fascinating. So whether it's better being like an emotional leader, showing emotions, or like a cold one or rather cold one. Yeah.
It's more about understanding the role of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
It means being able to perceive and relate to others people's feelings.
Okay.
It's not about the expression. No, exactly.
Okay, so it's not about the emotions displayed by... Anyway, I'm just interested is if you have to be an emotional person to read emotions and to be more empathetic. That's a good question, by the way. But yeah, you don't have to answer that. It's just for me. Unless you have something for me.
Yeah, maybe later, off records.
Okay. Daniel, your emotional intelligence is crap. No. So we are at our last segment that you, as you told me, very much looking forward to, the quick fire round. 5 short questions, 5 spontaneous answers, no overthinking allowed. Are you game?
Maybe.
More or less.
Let's go.
The quick fire round.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received, professionally or personally?
Many times, when studying or researching communication, so whether in your projects, dissertation, or other work, you're often encouraged to narrow your focus. But once I was told, and I agree, that it's more beneficial to expand your perspective, to explore the relationships between various topics and fields, and even the broader geopolitical landscape, whether you pursue academia or a professional career. And I like this broad horizontal perspective on life and work.
If you weren't a communication scholar, what career do you think you'd have pursued?
Perhaps a nature-inspired wellness consultant.
Okay.
Who guides individuals on outdoor retreats, focusing on the benefits of nature, mindfulness, and hiking. All things I cannot do as an academic.
Okay. Question number 3. If you could instantly solve one challenge in DEI management, what would it be?
The challenge of inclusive language.
Okay.
So what to do with it? What's the correct way to go about inclusive language?
Okay. Do you have an answer for that?
Of course not.
Okay. Yeah, it's a difficult topic, but I'm pretty sure you will come up with a solution at some point. Question number 4. Imagine your life as a movie. What would be the title of it?
Blank.
Blank. I like it.
What I have in mind is the boring life of an academic.
Okay.
A thriller.
A thriller. Okay. Final question. If you had unlimited resources for your next research project, what would you study?
Well, it's not more what, but with whom.
Mm-hmm.
I have the privilege of working with, many incredible colleagues globally, including you, Daniel.
Yay!
So I make it a point to connect and collaborate with as many of you as possible, but you need money for such big, big projects.
So it's more about who and not about what.
Yes, yeah.
Good. Thank you so much. So that was the quick fire round.
I don't know how it went. You had so many questions. So I hope I covered something interesting for, not just for academics, but also for real people listening to your podcast.
Real people, yeah. Yeah, we academics are not real people. That's true. Silvia, this has been such a fascinating and important conversation. Many thanks for sharing your insights, experiences, and future research plans with us. It's been such a pleasure diving into the complexities of DEI communication and management. Grazie mille and ciao.
Grazie a te, Daniel. Ciao a tutti.
That was the Lab Talk with Silvia. As always, I hope you picked up some useful insights, whether for your professional life, personal growth, or just to sound extra smart in your next conversation. I, for one, learned that I might be too emotionally intelligent. Or maybe just emotionally unstable. I'm still working on that diagnosis. Yet, one thing is crystal clear from Silvia's insights. Leadership is key to creating a truly inclusive workplace. While communication, both internal and external, remains essential for raising awareness, no amount of DEI talk can compensate for a leadership style that contradicts inclusivity. In short, if leadership doesn't walk the talk, the whole effort falls apart. If you're eager to learn more, Silvia handpicked 5 key publications, all linked in the show notes. And now, the usual housekeeping. Follow the Community Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podcastle. Subscribe on YouTube, hit the notification bell, and connect with us on LinkedIn to stay in the loop. And, of course, sharing is caring, so spread the word. Thanks. Next time, I'll be joined by Professor Ganga Danesh from the University of Maryland. We will explore corporate social advocacy, how it connects to corporate social responsibility, and why speaking up for social causes is a must for organizations that truly want to drive social change. Until next time, and remember, communication is everywhere. It's in what you say, what you don't, and sometimes even in the way Cybertrucks get fiery redesigns. Stay curious and keep the conversation alive.